Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment of the School of Humanities lecture series. I'm delighted to have Neil McIntyre from History here, and Neil will be talking about reframing the Covenant.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Michael, and thank you to you all for coming along today and giving up your lunch break to listen to the Covenants. It's quite surprising from my point of view. So yes, I'm Neil McIntyre. I'm lecturer in Scottish history. My research interests are really in relation to Scotland's religious and political culture from about 1638 really right through to the present day. My research up to now has really been focused on the ideological development of Scotland's covenants, particularly after 1660, but I do look at the 1640s as well. My lecture today is actually based on a forthcoming co-authored article that I've been working on with a colleague and friend, Dr. Jamie McDougall. Jamie, like me, is similarly obsessed with the Covenants. It has been really useful to have someone to bounce some ideas off of, and we have both been really fascinated by this solemn acknowledgement, and particularly the resubscription process that occurs in 1648. There really has been a dearth of research on this resubscription campaign. All the attention goes towards 38 and 43, less attention paid to 1648. So to cut to the chase, this is the document that I'm really focusing on for the course of the lecture. A solemn acknowledgement of public sins and breaches of the covenant, and a solemn engagement to all the duties contained therein. Now we'll start unpacking this shortly. I would also note that you can actually find this document in Glasgow University Library in the spectacular Ogilvie collection. So if you want to go look at this yourself and then come back at me and say, you were wrong, McIntyre, then by all means do so. So basically this is issued in October 1648 by the Commission of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. And this is the Supreme Court of the Church of Scotland, and the Commission's its standing committee when it's not actually sitting. The document was part of a resubscription campaign involving the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant. And to make it completely clear what it is I'm trying to say today, my argument is that the nature and meaning of the covenant was reframed by a solemn acknowledgement. And I will unpack throughout the lecture how this happens. And then further from this, the reframing had a lasting impact on Scottish religious culture in the 17th and 18th centuries. So to give you a kind of very brief outline of where I'm going with this, I want to contextualize this resubscription by first of all considering the subscription of the covenants in the first place. So I'm going to try and avoid narrating the events surrounding the covenant and really focus in on the subscription process. So we'll look at the subscription of the National Covenant in 1638 and then the Solemn League in 1643. I'll then move on to look at the engagement crises, and the solemn acknowledgement is really reacting against this crisis in the early months of 1648. That will take a little bit of time to unpack. I'll then move on to look at the solemn acknowledgement in a bit more detail, and then I will finish the lecture by illustrating its legacy right up to the middle of the 18th century. Now, to avoid getting too bogged down in the narrative, I wanted to provide a timeline, and also these lecture slides will be available online afterwards. So if you're wanting to come back at this, I'm trying to try and make sense of the period. This will give you a kind of rough sort of starting off point. The key dates to look at, for those who are unfamiliar with the period, first of all, are 1603, Union of the Crowns. These resubscription campaigns are occurring after the Union of the Crowns of Scotland, England and Ireland. You'll also note that the National Covenant is issued some 30 years later, and in particular it's this awfully messy period that we're going to be focusing on here, where things get awfully complicated, and it's at least I'm going to try and attempt to make this a little bit clearer in the lecture. So the complexity of the 1648-51 period, and especially 1648-9, I would argue has both fascinated and baffled historians, is awfully complicated, particularly because political events are moving so quickly, and there's a variety of factions interacting with one another, and you've also got the reality that Scotland, England and Ireland are interacting with each other as well. Political events in one kingdom are affecting another. So this creates a very fluid political environment that is very tricky to study, and I think it has caused historians some problems, and there's not a full consensus in what's really going on here. Now, I'm particularly fascinated by this period from around July 1648 through to January 1649, where effectively the church and state authorities, the establishment is in a state of flux. Basically, you've got an army's moved south to England. This army is then quickly defeated in England, but there's a situation whereby the church and state authorities are currently in a state of flux. It's not quite clear who the establishment exactly is, because there's been a lot of factional disputes within the Covenanting movement. I think the reason this period has been neglected is also in the fact that it's in the shadow of the execution of Charles I, which, as you might imagine, has obviously garnered a lot of scholarly attention. I think that the focus on events in the later 1648 period through to the execution of Charles in January 1649 has basically led events in England to really take over the narrative, and the events in Scotland have been largely obscured as a result. And I think if our article does anything at all, it's to try and shed light in this period that has really been hitherto not dealt with in any great detail. Indeed, the sort of major scholars in this area have, while acknowledged the period, it's not really getting enough scholarly attention. At least that is what Jamie and myself would argue. So in her recent excellent book, Laura Stewart ultimately stops at the engagement crisis. Her book ends around May 1648, and therefore she can sort of sidestep some of these complicated issues later on in the year. In Alan McInnes's British Revolution, and then also in his biography of the Marquess of Argyll, McInnes is really focused in national politics and events at the national level and international level. He's not really considering what's happening at the local level, and I think that's a bit of a problem, and I think we can really delve deeper into what's going on in 1648. I'd also draw attention to Stevenson's narrative account in 1977, that although it doesn't go into great detail, this is still a fantastic narrative account that really helps us try and understand what it is that's going on. But Jamie and I would argue that we can drill deeper here and really look at what's going on in this particularly complex period. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in explaining the Scottish reaction to Britannic monarchy in the 17th century. For some of you, this will be very familiar stuff, but to very quickly run through the key issues. Effectively, there's been widespread dissent in Scotland, or discontent in Scotland with the policies of both James VI and First and Charles I. In terms of the kind of religious context, the key dates are the reintroduction of episcopacy in 1610, the issuing of the 5 Articles of Perth in 1618, the issuing of the Book of Canons by Charles I in 1636, and then the Service Book in 1637. So these do create a lot of religious discontent in Scotland, this idea that the Scottish Church's religious traditions are being overridden, that it's being brought into greater uniformity with the Church of England, some also deeming these as basically giving legitimacy to idolatrous practices that the Scottish Church, or at least some churchmen, believed should have been eradicated. There's also wider issues beyond religion. There's a Revocation Act in 1625, which agitates the landed classes. It would take another 3 or 4 hours to unpack the technical complexity of this act, and I'm going to spare you that for just now. All it needs to be emphasised is that the landed classes are deeply fearful of some of their rights and entitlements and privileges as a result of Charles's kind of high-handed political management. And this high-handed management also comes into the Scottish Parliament in 1633. So Charles has come to the throne in 1625. There's a Parliament not held until 1633. And when it sits, it's very carefully stage managed by Charles. He tries to make sure there's no dissent whatsoever. Indeed, when there is dissent registered, he's very much recognising who in the audience is voting against his policies. And then this culminates in 1634 with the trial of Lord Balmerino for leasing making. Effectively, he was used as a scapegoat. He held a pamphlet that was criticising government policy. The trial was a bit of a farce. Ultimately, Charles used it as a chance to basically show his clemency, but it sowed a lot of bad feeling, ill feeling amongst the landed classes. Now, I'm narrating the events behind the National Covenant would take some time. I'm going to try and avoid that as best I can. We'll look at how this was subscribed in a little bit later on. First of all, I just want to unpack what the National Covenant was for those who are unfamiliar. So the National Covenant effectively was to galvanise the Scottish nation against the government of Charles I. It basically rationalised resistance to his regime. The National Covenant can really be divided into three distinct parts. It includes the Negative Confession of 1580-81, which is basically a confession that was signed by James VI and his household, and it's basically a kind of list of it's anti-Catholic, it's virulently anti-Catholic, and outlines practices that should be eradicated from the Church of Scotland. This is followed by parliamentary statute that basically underlines this point, and then a bond of mutual association. Effectively, this is a band that's bonding these covenanters together in this cause. And ultimately, those who are entering into this covenant are promising to defend a variety of things. Now, first of all, they are promising to defend monarchy, at least the office of monarchy, if not the person, the monarch. They promise to defend true religion, although what this true religion actually is of course left studiously vague. There's also the promise to defend Scotland's laws and liberties, which are vaguely aligned with the Scottish Parliament, but again, there's some ambiguity there. And then above all, and probably the most radical aspect of this National Covenant, is that they are bonding to defend one another in the cause. They are to defend your fellow covenanters, and this is picked up later on by other groups and has a particularly subversive element to it. Now, this is all made infinitely more complicated with the addition of the Glasgow Declaration. Now, the National Covenant while it's understood to be a Presbyterian document, it never actually uses the word Presbyterian or presbytery once. Nor does it explicitly abjure episcopacy, nor does it actually overtly attack the 5 Articles of Perth. But when the General Assembly sits at the behest of Charles in the winter of 1638, it is ultimately resolved that, yes, the 5 Articles of Perth and bishops should be removed from the Church of Scotland. We then see it in this declaration from the Assembly that the 5 Articles of Perth and the government of the Kirk by bishops being declared to be abjured and removed, the civil places and power of Kirkmen declared to be unlawful, we subscribe according to the determination of the said free and lawful General Assembly. Now, what is interesting here is that Glasgow Declaration is then added onto these covenants. So you have a situation whereby you have folk who have subscribed this covenant here, the addendum has been added, and only a few people have then added their signatures again to this additional addendum. The basic issue you've now got is you've got some folk who've signed up to the original covenant, some who've signed up for the Glasgow Declaration, some have signed up to the covenant but not the declaration, and some haven't signed at all. It's created a very complex situation where different people think they've signed up for different things. So while in some sense it has united the nation, there's also the capacity for it to divide as well. So you can see here that while, yes, this has now been signed again, it has clearly not been signed by all the original signatories. And this creates particular problems later, and indeed critics of the covenant will highlight this kind of adding things later on and then saying that people are now held in perpetuity to uphold them. So let's think about how this document was subscribed. I think the first thing to recognise is that it's actually not issued formally by church or state. So we have to ask ourselves, from where did it draw its authority? And this is a question that again is asked by critics of the covenant. Where is this coming from? Now, it's ultimately issued by a group known as the Tables. They basically claim to be representing the estates, and they're drawing on the authority of the 3 estates to issue this. But it is ultimately not formally issued by, for example, the Scottish Parliament or the General Assembly. So this question of its authority is kind of left open, and in fact it becomes a bit of a vexed question of who ultimately does have authority over this. Is this the churches doing? Is it the states doing? Or might it actually belong to the people? And these questions are circling around in the 17th century. Secondly, there's no nationwide instructions for subscription. So you've got a situation where not only have you got a variety of different covenants, you've also got local and regional variation in terms of the subscription process. So basically, if you subscribed in the southwest, it might not necessarily have been the same process undertaken in the northwest or the northeast. Again, while they're looking for uniformity, in reality there's quite a lot of variation. Not everyone was having the same experience at the grassroots level. And then, as I've been trying to stress, several interpretations were possible. It was intentionally vague and ambiguous to try and comprehend as many people as possible. They're trying to unite the nation in opposition to Charles I. But this vagueness and ambiguity does ultimately leave some unanswered questions. So, I mean, there's dozens you could ask, but some of the key ones are, to what extent was loyalty to the monarch conditional? What exactly is true religion anyway? They seem to have a sense of what it might be, but it's not explicitly stated what it is. And then there's also the issue of priority. Should you be prioritizing defense of the king, of religion, or your fellow Covenanters? And different Covenanters over time put different emphases on different aspects of their obligations. And this ultimately leads to this paradox of the covenant. I think one, again, that's fascinated historians is the capacity for the covenant to unite is pretty remarkable in the early modern period, and yet at the same time, from about 1639, is already engendering widespread debate. It has the capacity to divide as well as unite. So we've had a quick look at the subscription process for the National Covenant. We'll now move on to look at the Solemn League, where the process was basically different in some really key ways. So the Solemn League, just for those who don't know, was effectively the Scottish Covenanters putting their Covenanting army at the disposal of the English parliamentarians who had similar grievances with Charles I. And in exchange for this military support, the Scots were going to help reform the Church of England along Presbyterian lines, although, as we'll quickly note, again the word Presbyterian studiously absent from the Solemn League and Covenant. Now, you'll have immediately noticed that this is a printed document and not a manuscript. So already at this stage, they're able to assert a bit more uniformity by having it printed and disseminated. The dissemination's a bit more effective, although you'll see some of the marginal additions still leaving plenty of room for interpretation by individual ministers. Now, these are the 6 articles. Ultimately, you're signing up to pursue uniformity of worship, discipline, and government in the churches of Scotland and England and Ireland. You're looking to eliminate, it's the usual shopping list of complaints by Presbyterians: popery, prelacy, i.e. episcopacy, superstition, heresy, and schism. They're upholding the rights of parliaments, the king, and the subjects. They have to discover and punish enemies of the covenant, otherwise known as malignants, and we'll come back to that term a little bit later on. You have to preserve the Anglo-Scottish Union, and there is recognition that there been centuries of conflict between Scotland and England, that the fact there is this confederal union is a kind of providential moment. We've been squabbling for so many years. It's remarkable we've now joined in this kind of religious experiment. And then ultimately, yet again, you have to defend all those who've entered into the covenant. Okay, so these are some of the kind of key differences I think you'll notice in comparison to the National Covenant. I think that the first, when we looked at the issue of authority, the Solemn League is much more clearly or more obviously issued by the authorities. It's approved by both church and state. It's been underwritten by the establishment. And you can also see this in the organisation as well. It's basically legislated for by the General Assembly and then disseminated throughout the church court system of the Church of Scotland. As I've already alluded to, in terms of its dissemination, this is printed, it's not manuscript, so while there's still room for additions and so on in the margins, I think this has a better chance of establishing uniformity throughout Scotland. Now, the service wasn't prescribed in the same way that the national covenants hadn't been either, but when you look at the records at the local level, you can see there's fairly well-established patterns. There's, again, a bit more uniformity in how this has been carried out. So first and most obviously, there's a set day for this. The 29th of October is set for subscription of the Solemn League in comparison to the National Covenant, which was really taken over 1638 right into 1639, and there was still people taking it in the spring of 1639. There was then a fairly sort of uniform service involving a sermon, the covenant being read, the congregation swearing collectively, and then subscriptions according to the social hierarchy. So ultimately it was the nobles who were signing first, running through the lairds, and then down into the commoners. In terms of its ideology, while I would still contend that yes, it is still ambiguous in several key respects, it is ultimately clearer and more concise than the National Covenant. The 6 articles are certainly less ambiguous than the kind of ramblingness of the National Covenant. I don't know if there's many historians who have actually read it from start to finish. Ultimately, despite the tighter control, and it is slightly less ambiguous, there is still the problem of interpretation remaining. And again, when you look at some of the entries in the Kirk Session records, you can see some of this. So in the Dalkeith Kirk Session, it's understood as an effectual mean for repressing idolatry and uniting the 3 kingdoms and a uniform religion and discipline, that God's church may enjoy purity and peace. Now this chimes with what the General Assembly's message. It chimes with what they're trying to get across. But then when we look at Walter Balcanmo, the Minister of Trinent and Seaton, he said in a later deposition, the first covenant was a religious and godly work, but for the League and Covenant, I never understood it. I never knew what it meant. So clearly there was some issues with trying to get across the ideas of the Solemn League if a fairly substantial minister was unable to understand really where this was coming from and what it was doing. So we can see it's slightly more clear, slightly more concise. It's certainly got, it's underwritten by the authorities, but the interpretation is still open there. There's still the issue of individual ministers, interpreting it in the way that they would. So again, we'll skip from 1643 through to 1647. I could give several lectures on the intervening period alone, and we'll spare you the details. For now, what's key to note is that the Civil War by November 1647 is temporarily over, and Charles is now imprisoned on the Isle of Wight. But there's increasing concern, particularly amongst the Scottish nobility, that whereas this movement had been really reinforcing their power and their status in society, increasingly the civil wars are undercutting their authority. We then see the Earls of Lanark, Loudon and Lauderdale go to Charles and basically make a secret treaty in order to try and establish his rescue. And it's this secret treaty which is known as the Engagement. Ultimately, so Lanark, Loudon and Lauderdale are aligned with the Duke of Hamilton, who takes the covenant to get into the Scottish Parliament and ultimately is able to basically subvert the covenanting movement. Now, I think what's interesting is the Scottish Parliament ultimately sees 56 nobles attend, which is the highest attendance by the nobility through the entire 1640s. So there's a clear sense that the nobility are on side with this. They feel that rescuing the king unilaterally in defiance of the Solemn League is the way to go. Ultimately, we also can see that there's several new shire and borough commissioners who are sitting in the Scottish Parliament for the first time in 1648, and they're all aligned with this Hamilton faction. Now, the engagement's terms ultimately dilute the covenanting cause insofar as Charles I and his English subjects were not to be obliged to take the Solemn League and Covenant. They could be offered it, but didn't necessarily have to take it. And a Presbyterian settlement of the Church of England was only to be trialled for 3 years, and if it was unsuccessful, didn't have to be implemented. So for some, this was diluting the cause somewhat. But ultimately, the Scottish Parliament supports the engagement. Hamilton's able to push it through, and it's still professing the ends of the covenant. So the ends of the covenant for defence and reformation of religion, the honour and happiness of the king and his royal posterity, and the peace and safety of his kingdom. Now, I think what's interesting actually is that contemporary commentators believe that at least some of these politicians are cynically using covenanting language to pursue this, that they don't necessarily believe in the covenants, and this is a kind of sop to others in the Parliament to try and push through the engagement. And then, despite trying to raise an army of around 40,000 men, I think he gets about half that number. The engagers are embarrassingly smashed at Preston by the New Model Army led by Oliver Cromwell. Now, there had been protest against the engagement. There had been an anti-engager faction led by the Marquess of Argyll in the Scottish Parliament. Argyll had really been the nominal leader of the Covenanting movement since the winter of 1638. He'd been key in pushing some of that legislation in the 1640s, and his faction were trying to oppose the engagement in the Scottish Parliament. They're latterly known as the Kirk Party. But particularly important for this lecture is that the General Assembly is protesting the engagement, and contemporary commentators are really interpreting this as church versus state. The church and state are both proclaiming the ends of the covenants. They're both arguing that their policy is the true policy for pursuing the covenanting cause. And ultimately, the General Assembly is vigorously protesting this engagement, saying that it's breaking, indeed, all the articles of the Solemn League and Covenant. There's also popular resistance to this in the southwest of Scotland and Ayrshire. Around 2,000 men resist recruitment into the Engager army, and certainly one commentator, Sir James Turner, argues that it's been the haranguing of the ministers that's ultimately led people to think, well, I'll risk treason because I'm more concerned about my soul and being potentially excommunicated from the church. When the engagement fails in Preston, it's from this southwest base, the heartlands of the Covenant, that a coup d'etat is launched to basically try and overturn this engager regime. So you've now got two factions, both proclaiming the Covenant, basically trying to compete to control the mechanisms of church and state. And it's this group, the anti-engagers, that have support from Cromwell and the New Model Army. And eventually the engagers are brought to heel by the Treaty of Stirling. And crucially, they're going to be in the future excluded from public office. But there's an issue here. The anti-engagers are basically in a situation where the church and state authorities basically need reconstituted. The post-engagement church and state need to be validated in some way, need to be legitimised. And it's at this point that they come up with the idea of a resubscription campaign to basically reinvigorate the covenanting cause and justify the covenants being pursued by church and state. I'm doing for time. Okay. So to break down the Solemn Acknowledgement, we can break it into sort of four key aspects. So the first, the top part, Solemn Acknowledgement of public sins. Part of this process is going to be repenting the 1648 engagement. As far as the anti-engagers are concerned, defeat by Cromwell is evidence of God's providence. It's evidence of God's displeasure with the Covenanted Scots. And therefore we can say comfortably, well, it doesn't have divine backing. We should throw it out, start again. The next part is actually surprisingly subversive. There's an assertion of duties of the covenant, but this is actually clarifying the matters that had been hitherto ambiguous. And by doing this kind of clarification process, we'll see the effect it has on the nature of the movement. Then, as I've already alluded to, or made clear, the renewal of the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant is going to accompany this. So this is going to involve a resubscription campaign to the covenant. But then, most importantly for the future, there's now going to be restricted access to communion. The resubscription to the covenant is going to also involve being part of a communion celebration, except that the engagers are not going to be allowed to be part of this process. And this is absolutely crucial because communion, is a very clear expression of a congregation's relationship with one another, the relationship to God. This sort of strict access to communion, this exclusiveness, is really radically changing what communion means in the Church of Scotland. It is effectively being used for political purposes. So to run through the resubscription campaign, there are certainly echoes of the campaign for the Solemn League in 1643. So again, it's the church court system that are pursuing this. It's the committee of the Kirk that initially initiates the whole process, and then the instructions are carried out throughout the church courts. There's a very clearly prescribed procedure to this, unlike previous subscriptions. So there's very detailed instructions issued to the church courts on how this is all going to play out. It's clear that that each action is going to be very symbolic, and it's going to display, the kind of meaning that this anti-engager regime is trying to get across. So throughout this week, the 10th, the 14th and 17th, there'll be fasts held in order to basically recognise their confession of sins. The Solemn Acknowledgement was then to be read on the 17th alongside the Solemn League and Covenant. So you're now having the Solemn League being refracted through this document. The covenant was then to be resubscribed along with a communion celebration. This communion celebration had not been part of the previous two subscription campaigns. And then what I would argue is that this rhetoric of renewal is ultimately masking the reframing of the covenant in this new environment. So I'll kind of unpack some of the ways I feel that the covenant is being reframed here. Now, the first thing is that the church is making a bold claim to be the sole interpreter of the covenant. Having vigorously protested the engagement and had its calls go unheeded, they are now trying to assert that yet we are the interpreters of the covenant, and that if the state makes any moves, they need to take the church's views into consideration. I think that is particularly important to consider. And while the state is trying to reconstitute itself, I think it recognises that the church's vigorous opposition to the engagement will help the new state legitimise itself. Now, an idea I'm still playing around with is this idea of equality in the covenant. Now, the word equality and covenant in the same sentence doesn't really seem right to most of us who are here, but there's a really interesting social dynamic to this document where kings, magistrates, officers, ministers, and people are deemed to be all equally sinful before God. And there's a really interesting subversive dynamic to this, that while there is still a social hierarchy, ultimately before God there is going to be this kind of equality. And I think, again, later groups of dissenters are going to take this idea on, that we've all got duties in the covenant, and if your leaders aren't upholding them, well, they have to be held accountable. Also interesting is the way it's clarifying some of the earlier aspects. So where there'd been some ambiguity around the conditional allegiance to the king, this document is very explicitly about conditional allegiance, and there's a very explicit condemnation of arbitrary government. So whereas there'd been some room for manoeuvre in the previous covenants, this is very explicitly saying that we owe a conditional allegiance, and that is all. As I've already stressed, this covenant communion idea becomes absolutely central, and is ultimately really reframing the covenant. Whereas previously it had been about national inclusion, getting as much of the nation involved in this endeavour, it is now that idea is being subordinated to the idea of confessional purity, that only true covenanters are part of the cause and everybody else should be excluded. And linked into this, what justifies this move is what I've deemed, or what I've called, the doctrine of sinful association. This is an idea put forward by George Gillespie, basically where he argues that covenants should not be kept with the ungodly, and especially, quote, a wicked faction and malignant party. Again, rhetoric that we picked up by Presbyterians later on in the century. Now, this idea of sinful associations is particularly important, so it's worth just pausing to reflect on it. Gillespie had really risen to fame in the 1640s as one of Scotland's most esteemed theologians. And in 1648, he was the moderator of the Commission of the Kirk. However, he was ill at the time of the kind of reconstituting of church and state, but he ultimately writes a letter to the commissions basically making clear that engagers should not be allowed back into public office. And he makes the case that if you protested the engagement, then you must therefore separate yourself from engagers. So I quote, "I know and am persuaded that all the faithful witnesses that gave testimony to the thesis that the late engagement was contrary and destructive to the covenant will also give testimony to the appendix, that compliance with any who have been active in the engagement is most sinful and unlawful." So he's clearly justifying this exclusionary impulse, this separation from the sinful. So whereas it had been vague to include as many people as possible, it is now really trying to narrow things down, so we've only got the sincere covenanters as far as they're concerned. Now, what's interesting is Gillespie actually dies 2 days after this letter is issued, and it is interpreted as a kind of deathbed testimony against the engagement. And I think that gives us a little bit of extra oomph when they're considering some of his ideas. And I would argue that this is more or less swallowed wholesale and then funneled into the Solemn Acknowledgement. Another way of considering this resubscription campaign is almost as a kind of exercise in sort of mass corporate discipline. There's something here that sort of, the campaign's not really dissimilar to the processing of penitents before the church courts. Effectively, we've now got the covenanted nation on trial for its failings, and it's now going to have to show repentance. And again, the subversive social dynamic is playing out here. No one is exempt from this process, and indeed one gets the feeling that the nobility, having led the engagement, are being targeted. So again, the church court records are rife with nobles actually being brought to heel in a way that really we haven't quite seen before. So here's just a few examples. Lord William Cochrane, barred from taking the covenant and communion by the Presbytery of Ayr. Lord Elibank showed great weakness and was barred along with John Durham of Pitcairn by the Presbytery of Haddington. And Sir James Balfour of Dinmilne, the Lord Lion, was actually forced to make public repentance in order to continue in his office. And John Young has posited, and I think fairly, that this would seem like an anti-aristocratic reaction to the nobles attempting to basically wrestle control of the covenanting cause and direct it in a particular way as to reinforce their own authority. And also to make sure there was no dissenting voices within the church, 72 pro-engagement ministers are deposed. So there's a sense of trying to purge the institutions to make sure that we're all on side and we're all agreeing that the engagement was a complete disaster and we're going to move on. Now, I'm going to talk about the ideological legacy, and then in the ensuing slides try and sort of show its development through to the 18th century. I think the first thing we notice is that the Solemn Acknowledgement is now part of the furniture when it comes to the covenants. It's part of covenanting political language, and it will be invoked by the real hardliners going forward into the 17th or the later 17th and 18th centuries. We see it invoked explicitly in the renewals of the covenants by the United Societies in 1689 and 1712, although interestingly it is not renewed in 1666 during the Pentland Rising. The idea of covenanting and communion has a major impact in the development of Presbyterian confessional culture after 1660. So again, very briefly to fill you in on this, the covenants are ultimately revoked by the Scottish Parliament in 1661. There's then the development of Presbyterian dissent, those who believe the covenants are still operative. But ultimately, this relationship between the covenant and communion starts to divide Scottish Presbyterians. Some Presbyterians believe that all it's really leading to is division amongst themselves, and it's hampering their cause of trying to get the covenants back into operation, or at least a Presbyterian church. Whereas you have others asserting that no, unity is not as important as making sure we maintain purity, that we are all in the cause together and that we're not engaging with those who are sinful. So, for example, if a minister has denounced the covenant from the pulpit, people are using this doctrine to justify their separation from these ministers. The minister's denounced the covenant, he's been sinful, I'll therefore separate myself from them. And then going forward, once you have the separatist group, the United Societies, breaking away from the Presbyterian mainstream, they really invoke the Solemn Acknowledgement as a kind of distinctive feature of their religious culture. They continue to invoke it up to the 1760s and beyond. And indeed, it's not just the United Societies, I should say, become the Reformed Presbyterian Church. And both the Church in Scotland, Ireland and the United States are continuing to draw on that past, continuing to discuss the engagement of 1648, some 100 years later, and continuing to use the Solemn Acknowledgement. And as we'll see in my next slides, what's particularly interesting is that this very idea of acknowledging sins is basically used to continue to adapt the covenants, that they keep adding additional sins as time moves on. There's another 20 years have passed, we've accumulated more sins, well, let's make sure we acknowledge them. The list does become pretty spectacular. So to kind of work our way through some of the kind of key documents from the period, This division between Presbyterians actually is rooted in the 1650s when they're arguing over whether should the engagers be allowed back in to defend the covenants, or should we continue to exclude them. As far as the protesters are concerned, in documents such as these, the solemn acknowledgement has been passed by the church authorities and must be upheld. We have to remain free of association with malignants. And indeed, when they're inquiring into the causes of the Lord's wrath in 1653, one of the causes is noted as superficial admitting to the covenants and the solemn acknowledgement without taking sufficient pains to instruct and inform them in the knowledge of the things contained therein. Continuing to be invoked towards the end of the 1650s, and it's still being used by non-conforming Presbyterians in the early 1660s. And particularly interesting is this top quote where James Stewart of Gutters, the lawyer who's helped draft the Natali, notes that, hence, as the covenant itself, so the solemn acknowledgement of sins and engagement to duties became national, authorised by the supreme judicatures of church and state, and are still obliging by oath. It has almost managed to achieve the same status that the covenants have in the minds of some Presbyterians. And indeed, in the scaffold testimonies that are also appended to Naphtali, we see it invoked by both James Guthrie and Archibald Johnson of Warriston. Now, I would note that these printed testimonies are, of course, fraught with problems there in terms of editing and editorializing, but I think it's still fascinating that, at least according to the printers, that the solemn acknowledgement was recognized as part of their testimony before they died. When the Presbyterians dispute how much they can engage with the Restoration state, John Brown, from his comfort of exile in Rotterdam, basically invokes the engagement once again to say that they couldn't engage with a sinful engager state, so therefore they should not engage with the Restoration state either. And again, 1648 is invoked to justify this policy of exclusion and of non-engagement. It's invoked again by Shields and A Hind Let Loose, and it is explicitly included in this renewal of the covenants by the group, the United Societies, in 1689. And I've noted here that there are indeed many additions in the acknowledgement of sins and engagement to duties, which also were then solemnly renewed, because the late unhappy times of defection had produced many other sins that could be confessed in that acknowledgement in 1649. So it's kind of created a culture of ideological adaptation, that the covenants can be adapted in light of political events. We've accumulated more sins, political developments have led us to having to denounce more issues at stake. It's still being invoked by the societies after the revolution of 1690. I've recently been looking at the Society's records after 1690, and they're still discussing it in their meetings. These meetings were held out of doors. They noted in 1694 that we concluded that our covenants with the acknowledgement of sins and engagement to duties be read apart from them upon our fast days, and some questions raised from them, keeping them in recent memory. Remembering this solemn acknowledgement was apparently deemed as important as remembering the covenants. I wanted just to very quickly throw in that the National Church of Scotland hasn't entirely abandoned the covenants either. There is an internal subscription campaign in the Synod of Galloway and also the Synod of Glasgow Ayr, again the Covenanting Heartlands, where they basically write out a statement noting that they declared their adherence to the whole of our covenanted work of Reformation. The covenants might not have been restored in 1690, but there were still plenty of people in the church who believed that they were operative. Again, as another renewal of the covenants in 1712, the acknowledgement very much part of that process. Again, the asterisks noting the additions we're going to add in to the current situation. So this is reacting against, for example, the Union of 1707 and the Toleration Act of 1712. It's invoked again by, I can't remember who this is now, name escapes me, but what you'll notice here is the recognition of Gillespie as having a major role ideologically, and again, this idea of sinful associations. The very document itself is actually reissued in 1715, basically arguing that we cannot engage with Jacobites. That would be a sinful association. So this was basically them saying that they won't come out in arms to basically uphold the Jacobite cause. And in fact, many of the Covenanters in this period basically refused to fight one side or the other. They're no more Hanoverians than they are Jacobites. It's included in 1718. Again, this is them making it clear that just because they don't like Jacobites doesn't mean they support Hanover. And then by 1741, they are still including this as part of their declaration. So we're now nearly a century on from the Solemn League, and this is still part of Scotland's Protestant culture. Now, what's interesting is by the 1730s, another substantial secession has taken place from the Church of Scotland, and they create what's known as the Secession Church in 1733. Now, what's interesting is that this church and the Reformed Presbyterians both go to renew the covenants on the centenary of the Solemn League in 1743. Now, the seceders intentionally omit the solemn acknowledgement of sins. You can see without the solemn acknowledgement of sins and engagement to duties. This group just believe that this is been added on later and shouldn't really be part of the renewal process. And this then allows the Reformed Presbyterians to step into the breach and say, aye, that document's ours, the covenanting tradition is ours, and you aren't really the true covenanters. And so they basically point out here that, I think it's right at the bottom, the acknowledgement of sins, engagement to duty 1648, both which the seceders have barefacedly cast by and exploded. So there's a new dissenting group. The Reformed Presbyterians are saying, look, we're the real dissenters, and we've been controlling the covenant for some time, and they don't like these upstarts, the seceders. And ultimately, I love this diagram. It really shows you just how complex Scotland's religious politics ultimately get. Now, while the Solemn Acknowledgement is not involved in all of these disputes, this idea of unity and purity in some ways shapes many of the debates that are going on. That idea continues to shape religious debate into the mid-18th and early 19th century. So to very quickly summarise, the resubscription campaign was wide-ranging and effective, and I think it's important to emphasise. There's a view that by 1648 the covenanting regime is kind of coming to an end, but for Jamie and myself, this flies in the face of the evidence which suggests that there really is widespread subscription to this new regime. The covenants have not lost their legitimacy just yet, and I think we'll need to explore a little bit more about what's going on there. As I've tried to stress, the Solemn Acknowledgement has subtly reframed the covenant, it's clarified particular issues, and therefore made it much more difficult to make it an inclusive movement. There is a clear social dynamic and anti-aristocratic dimension to this in the way that the nobility are prosecuted during the engagement and the way they're condemned in the Solemn Acknowledgement. There's now this link between covenanting and communion that hadn't been there hitherto. And as my little trip through the later 17th and 18th centuries has shown, this idea of ideological adaptation has been established. So whereas you've got ideologues saying that the covenant is timeless and unchanging, the reality is that it's highly adaptable, that it is constantly adapted, and indeed they are aware that they are doing so. And this kind of flies in the face of this sort of timeless mentality that they're trying to put forward. So that's the lecture for today, and I really look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you. Just enough time.
Brilliant, many thanks, Bill. And we've got time for a couple of questions.
Hi.
Yeah, fabulous lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is a very complex period. I wonder if you could just talk about the theme of gender, because you've talked about the subversive effect of the covenant, and one of the things that's very striking about the covenants is that they're sworn by the whole congregation, even if only for the most part wouldn't sign it. Is that something that you could sort of weave into this in terms of the significance of the whole congregation swearing it, in terms of embedding those ideas and giving it that longevity?
I don't think we could be here for another hour if I tried to answer that fully. Yes, there is definitely this gender component to it that is obviously remarkable, and some of the agency that can be expressed by women in the context of the covenants, particularly after 1660 when they're dissenting, is pretty remarkable. As far as I'm aware, they're swearing but not necessarily subscribing the covenant. And we've only got the sort of tantalising references to what's going on, but there's certainly references to women supporting the engagement, and there's also references to women it's basically supporting the anti-engagers. So I think there's one instance of a minister being harangued by basically attacking the engagers, and there's several instances of women rioting in reaction to the doctrine that ministers were expounding. Where that features in the development of the Solemn Acknowledgement, I think I'd have to think a little bit more deeply and also go back to the records and really see what's going on. But yes, I think you can certainly see by the later 17th century the kinds of actions that are possible for women in this context, I would argue, are pretty remarkable.
Can I ask about... Sorry, no, you're the expert.
Not at all. I don't know if anyone is actually daunting stuff. That was great. Thanks very much. I understand it better than before. I just wanted to ask about, I noticed in connection with the printed texts, Solemn and Solemn Acknowledgement, it was printed by the King's printer, and Gillespie's text might be different if you printed in London. I just wondered whether there is an issue there, or there's any kind of debate or interest in terms of who you actually, by what press you choose to publish these texts.
I think that's a good point. The main thing to mention here is that the printing situation in Scotland is contrasting quite sharply with what's going on in England. So the lapsing of the licensing laws in England in the 1640s do lead to this explosion of print, and there's many of those this room will know all about this, that there's lots of printers and thousands of items being printed in England. It contrasts somewhat with the situation in Scotland, where there is more of a sense of print being controlled. The Church of Scotland particularly is controlling the output of print in the 1640s. Most of the documents printed are being vetted. They also have their own printer as well. They're trying to keep a lid on opinion on the covenant. They're trying, where there is political engagement going on here, they're not asking the people for their opinion on the covenant. They're telling them how the covenant is supposed to be. And that's why I've argued that, first of all, the printing situation is to try and close off avenues for debate as far as they're concerned. I hadn't actually considered the different printers for the Solemn League and the Solemn Acknowledgement, and I actually need to go back and just have a quick look at who's been doing the printing, also for Gillespie's text. I should probably also acknowledge that Gillespie's text is also for an English audience. He's trying to make clear that, don't worry, we've got nothing to do with the engagement, and we still are very committed to this union with you guys. We want to pursue the Solemn League. It's to make clear that there's no further threat from Scotland, because there's also the issue of, if they were seen to be letting engagers back in, as they do certainly in a couple of years' time, they then have Cromwell and the New Mall Army in the back doorstep waiting to come in. So I think it's to basically assure the English that no, everything is fine here, don't worry about us, and indeed what happens later demonstrates the kind of coercive edge to these kind of negotiations.
Let's thank Neil for
Thank you.